Okay, it is officially noon, so let's get started. Hello and welcome to the second installment of our 2023 Ask the Alliance webinar series. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Adam Miller, the communications director here at the Alliance for the Chesapeake Bay, and I'm so excited to be here with you today. A few housekeeping notes before we get started. If you wish to have your camera on, please feel free to, but we ask that you keep your microphones muted so that we can hear the presentation today. We will be collecting questions throughout the presentation. So we've got a team monitoring Facebook and monitoring Zoom for your questions here in the chat. So as you get them and they're fresh in your mind, please feel free to ask them through the chat feature of this meeting. And our team will be collecting those answers and relaying them to Eric to answer at the end of the presentation. Before I turn things over to Eric, Eric, can you go to the next slide, please? Before I turn things over to Eric Breaker for his visual storytelling in Nature 101 presentation, I just want to give you a quick introduction to the Alliance for the Chesapeake Bay for all of you who are joining us for the first time. The Alliance was founded in 1971, and the Alliance is a nonprofit organization that restores the lands and waters of the Chesapeake Bay watershed. Our collaborative and action-oriented approach delivers on-the-ground solutions, technical assistance, and builds capacity to achieve healthier lands and cleaner water. Next slide, please, Eric. So for us here at the Alliance, what that really means is about working upstream to build resilience on the land for long-term improvements to water quality in our communities. And in order to do that, we have 4 offices that are strategically chosen in specific areas of the watershed. We're headquartered in Annapolis, but we have offices in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, Richmond, Virginia, and Washington, D.C. as well. Next slide, please. And we do our work out of those 4 offices with 4 main program areas of agriculture, forest, green infrastructure, and stewardship and engagement. Each of those programs is designed to bring much needed solutions to the problems that affect the Chesapeake Bay downstream. Next slide, please. If you're interested in learning more about this work, I encourage you to visit our website at allianceforthebay.org. I have our volunteer page up here on the screen, as well as a QR code that takes you to that page. Because if you're really interested in getting involved in our work, I encourage you to check out that volunteer page where you can find all of the events that give you an opportunity to join us in the field to learn more about our work, help plant trees, maintain trees, clean up your neighborhoods, and so much more. Next slide, please. So for the next few weeks, the Alliance is going to be bringing you some exciting presentations from our passionate staff here at the Alliance, and that's why you're all here today. So some of our presentation today is obviously about visual storytelling in nature, but we've got other upcoming presentations such as converting lawn to native meadow habitat, long distance kayaking, foraging, aquatic macroinvertebrates, DIY rain gardens, and turtles of the Chesapeake Bay. And I can't say enough about the passion of our staff in general, but through these topics, we're tapping into the things that really truly make our staff tick and really kind of drive our passion for protecting the Chesapeake Bay. And I know that for Eric Breaker, that passion is certainly storytelling and visual storytelling. So with that being said, I'm excited to hand it off to Eric and looking forward to hearing his presentation today.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for the intro, Adam, and you are spot on. So, hey, everyone, my name is Eric Breaker. I am a filmmaker, conservationist, and I have the privilege of specializing in multimedia at the Alliance for the Chesapeake Bay here. I wanted to say first, just thank you so much for giving your valuable time to be here, especially at lunch. That's asking a lot. And I'm extremely excited about today's presentation because, like Adam just said, I would argue that visual storytelling is my greatest passion. So I think the best place to start is just to talk about what I mean when I say visual storytelling, because it is a bit of a vague statement. And a more formal definition would say that visual storytelling involves the use of graphics, images, pictures, and video to engage viewers in an effort to drive emotions, engage communication, and motivate audience to action. And really, the importance and the power of storytelling when it comes to successful communication cannot be overstated. So for today's purposes and based off my own experience, we're going to be focusing on really just basic photo and video. And because of the amount of time, I'm going to be focusing less on anything technical and more on simple ways to make your art more aesthetically pleasing and emotionally engaging. So there will also be some themes of how these art forms inspire conservation as well, which I love. Whenever I can have those passions intersect, it's one of my favorite things. So to start, let's talk about my background a little bit. And for most of my life, I've had a deep passion for two things, that being nature and creative storytelling. And I know that sounds a little cheesy and like I maybe made it up for this presentation, but I promise I really didn't. You could pretty much always find me either outside in the woods growing up, doing something stupid, playing with my brother, or sneaking around and stealing the family camera to create stop motion animation Lego videos, which I would force my whole family to sit through. They're the best. So throughout the course of my life, I've really never stopped being passionate about those two things, the things being nature and creative storytelling. And I really cherish the times and the projects that allowed them to intersect. And I have quite a random array of photos here, as you can see. I'm exposing myself on the bottom left, with my early fishing video creation days with one of the first generation GoPros strapped to my head. And to the right of that, you can see one of my first filming adventures with my brother out west. I believe that was around 8 years ago. And then the rest are just kind of an assortment of random photos that show just the amazing places this hobby and this profession has taken me in a relatively short amount of time. And not just the places, but the experiences as well. From waterfalls in Iceland to, being face to face with mountain lions of the backcountry of Arizona. You never know where photography and videography and visual storytelling will take you. So one of those projects I was talking about that is kind of at the intersection of those two passions was in 2019, when my brother and I decided to create a short film about fly fishing within the Chesapeake Bay watershed called A Journey Upstream. Now, I'm not going to play the trailer here. It is available on YouTube. I just don't want to deal with Zoom and all of its weird audio functions, but I do invite you to go check it out. The full film is on YouTube too, if you are interested. But I can't say how much fun we had creating a project on this scale. And the film itself led us to countless other opportunities that we could have never imagined. So since then, our films have played in hundreds of theaters and festivals across the globe. We've been able to work with some really big organizations in the outdoor space, like Outside Magazine, and even the National Park Service. And our work has been licensed by streaming platforms like Carbon TV and Outside Plus. But most importantly, our work led me to my current role at the Alliance for the Chesapeake Bay, where I get to tackle projects that are at the intersection of my two passions on a daily basis. So as you can see here, we do have a lot of fun at the Alliance. We got some photos ranging from kayak trips to even our most recent employee retreat to the right. But my role at the Alliance allows me to travel around the watershed and interact with our partners and stakeholders to lift up relevant stories, showcase particular projects, and really motivate our audience to action. In other words, I manage and specialize in all things visual storytelling for the Alliance. So just for some context, I think most of the examples throughout this presentation are going to be from a recent project I tackled called the Chesapeake Tales. And the goal of this project was to showcase the diversity and the beauty of the Chesapeake Bay watershed and inspire anglers to connect with new fisheries. So we kind of did a lot with this project. We created a short film. We also created a 7-part video series, a podcast, and even a physical magazine that had a Chesapeake Bay edition. So the story followed my brother and I as we traveled over 1,000 miles in an old camper van throughout the Chesapeake Bay watershed in just 7 days. And along with that fun and engaging premise, we got to interview local experts and conservationists, including the Alliance's fearless leader, Kate Fritz. And they highlighted issues that their unique fisheries were facing, but they also talked about why people should care. And the goal of this project was to educate and connect people with the natural environments that surround the Chesapeake Bay by showcasing the beauty of the environments, the fisheries, and the people. So again, I'm not going to play the trailer. It is on YouTube, and the full series is on YouTube as well if you're interested in checking it out. But needless to say, after finishing this project, I really have been blown away by the amount of people and different communities that have learned all about the Chesapeake Bay watershed simply by watching the videos that we made, or even by looking at the photos that were taken during the journey that were then posted through social media or blog posts. So, I've even had messages from strangers around the country telling me how they never knew the Chesapeake Bay watershed had such beauty. And this slide kind of shows some more cool examples of people around the world learning about Chesapeake Bay because of our work. This map on the upper left here, every pin there represents a physical location where the film played in a theater at a film festival. So it's really just mind-blowing for me to look at that and think at all those different locations, people are getting a little bit of the Chesapeake Bay watershed. And in a way, we're connecting them, and they never could, being that far away without a piece of visual media. So to the right is the cover of the magazine we created, which obviously was more photo centered, but it was still cool. We got to tell the story of what happened and showcase a lot of the still photography. And the bottom two photos here are more of a fun example from last week, actually, where one of those film festivals was in Colorado at Coors Field, which is the Rockies Stadium, and the film played on the Jumbotron. So it's just mind-blowing to me that these people all the way on the West Coast in Colorado are now being connected to the Chesapeake Bay watershed just because of the film we made. So the reason I included this slide here is because in today's day and age with social media, you never really know who or how many people can see your art. And it's easy to see that your video or photo can get a grand total of 100 views. And some people can even be disappointed by that. But if you imagine a room full of 100 people looking at your photo or video in real time, that's a lot of people. And that's pretty powerful. So the underlying theme of this project we did, and honestly, the previous one, and really every project I do now, can be summarized by one of my favorite quotes here. And that's that we cannot protect something we do not love. We cannot love what we do not know, and we cannot know what we do not see. So as we transition here into some more practical photo and video techniques, I challenge you to keep this philosophy top of mind, because with every video clip and photo you create in nature, you not only have that personal immediate benefit of your own attention and presence with our environments, but you're also potentially sparking a connection and an appreciation between an unknown viewer of your work and the very environments that you are showcasing. So I have never been a very technical focused photographer or videographer. In fact, many people have been shocked when they ask me extremely technical camera questions that I just don't have the answer to. Of course, when you're shooting on more professional gear, you need a basic understanding of certain parameters, like I'm sure you've heard of exposure, aperture, and ISO, and shutter speed and frame rate for video as well. But once you have those settings dialed in and you have a basic understanding, you really should be focusing fully on what you're capturing and what story you're trying to tell. So if you're interested in learning more about these more advanced techniques, I'm going to include some of my favorite resources in the description of the YouTube video of this recording that will be posted this evening. And I'll reference some more of those resources as we go through the presentation, but I invite you to check that out later tonight or another day, whenever, because some of those resources have helped me a lot over the years. And obviously, we won't be able to cover everything you need to know about visual storytelling in this one presentation. So the best camera is the one you have with you. And man, have I found that to be true over the years. And nowadays, we all pretty much have an amazing camera in our pockets at all times. So here are some basics that you should know that'll guide you on the right path for your photography and videography journey. Now, while some of these tips are iPhone specific, just keep in mind that you could apply the same techniques to any other phones or camera. So let's start with some iPhone specific settings that can help you take better photos. And some of these are super useful things that I didn't even know until I prepared for this presentation that I'm glad I know now. So if you open the camera app on your phone, there are a number of different photo modes. There's portrait, just normal photo, and even panorama. And I'm going to be focusing on just the normal photo mode. But if you want more details of each mode, I've provided a resource in that YouTube description I've talked about. So looking at this screenshot I have here on the screen, I think the first thing we should cover is you can see there's a 1x and a 0.5x focal length option. You can see those two values right above where it says photo. And right now we are on 1x, which is just the normal generic view of iPhone, or really any phone. But the 0.5, if you switch to that, it'll zoom out and it's a wide angle. So a lot of people don't know that's there. And it can be useful, especially if you're in a tighter situation. I find myself using it a lot if I'm inside. But it's just good to know so you can play around with those two focal lengths. There's also the option you all probably know about, which is whether to turn the flash on or not, which is in the top left. Really, you shouldn't deal with that too much unless there's a very low light situation. But if you click on the arrow in the top center, right next to the flash, you get a host of different options. And this includes things like a self timer, which could be useful, or even the ability to adjust the exposure, which is pretty awesome to have on a phone nowadays. And exposure is really just a fancy word for how bright or dark the image is. Another fun fact I learned about the iPhone camera is that when you tap the screen, a yellow box appears that shows what is in focus. And you can see that on the screen there. So it's obviously tapped in the center, but you can tap around and whatever you tap should be in focus. And then after you tap that, you can see there's a little small sun to the right of the box. And you can slide that sun up and down, and that'll adjust the exposure of the image right there on the spot. And that can be super useful if you're in a situation where the lighting is uneven or weird. And it's just a very quick way to get your focus and make sure the brightness is where you want it. And then you're good to go. So now let's take a quick look at some of the video settings that you should know as well before we move on. And almost everything we just covered with iPhone photos can be applied to the video as well, but there are a couple of extra things to keep in mind. So when you open the camera app, there are also a few different video modes. There's time lapse, slow-mo, and video. And again, I'm just going to be focusing on the normal video mode, but feel free to use the resources to explore the other two. So again, looking here, you have the 1x and the 0.5x focal length options. Here now we've selected the 0.5, which is the wider angle. And you can see there's a little bit more of the plant to the left. You can even see a little bit of the fence to the right. It's clearly a wider angle. And for video, I do find myself using the wide angle a lot, especially if I'm moving around, maybe doing something that's more action oriented. I will use that 0.5x focal length. So again, option to use the flash or not is in the top left. There is the same yellow focus box with the exposure adjustment as well if you tap the screen. But as far as the differences go, you will see that there is a timer in the center that shows you the duration of your recording, which can be very helpful. And then to the right of that, in the top right, you can see there's two values. Now, the value on the left is what's called your resolution, and that'll say either HD or 4K. And we won't get into all the details about this stuff because we don't have the time for it. But the resolution is essentially just how much detail you can see in your image. But to be honest, between HD and 4K, they're both pretty high quality for a cell phone. So the value on the right next to the resolution, is what's called your frame rate. And that will say either 24, 30, or 60 on the iPhone. Now, frame rate is, those values stands for frames per second. And again, there could be a whole presentation on just these two things, but for time's sake, we won't dive into that. So to just be super simple about it, let's say you care about storage on your phone. Maybe you don't have unlimited storage. You should just pick HD resolution at 30 frames per second. And if you have plenty of storage, maybe you have unlimited storage and you don't care about, file sizes, and you just want the highest quality possible, you should pick 4K at 24 frames per second. So I know that was super brief and quick, but now that we've talked about some of the basic settings that you should play with and get familiar with, let's talk about some general photography and videography basics that'll send you on your way to create some meaningful nature content. So starting with composition. In visual arts, composition is really just the arrangement of visual elements within a frame. And the term literally means putting together. So it's your job to organize the objects in your frame. And in most cases, if you can apply the basic rules of composition, the viewer's eye will automatically be drawn to the most important part of the image. And a well-composed shot will stand out and is often the most obvious factor to distinguish between a good and great photographer, videographer. So there are countless factors that contribute to the composition of your image, including shape, form, texture, and color, just to name a few. But we're going to be mainly talking about one rule of composition that you probably heard of that'll elevate both your photos and your videos. And if you want to learn more about the different layers of composition, again, check out that YouTube description later, because I will have a link to some of my favorite resources there. And that rule is the rule of thirds, which is probably the most popular and important rule of composition to understand. So this rule splits your screen into a 3x3 grid. And the idea is to strategically place the important subjects of your photo and video at key intersections on the grid. So the viewer's attention will naturally gravitate towards these key points, and it'll help you create a more aesthetically pleasing image. And it's just a good guide to have, especially when starting out. So I also have a quick pro tip before I talk about these examples here, and that is for your iPhone. You can add a rule of thirds grid that just stays permanently on your camera, which is what I've done, and it's super helpful. And you can find out how to do that easily online, but all you do is you go to settings, scroll down to camera, and then you can just turn on the option that says grid, and you have this rule of thirds grid built into your phone. But to look at the examples I have here, I wanted to pick an array of different ways that you could use the rule of thirds grid. So if you look at the example in the middle here, it's of one of my good friends, Jonathan, who was out fishing for striped bass on his boat in the Chesapeake Bay. And you can clearly see here that he is perfectly lined up with that intersection, the top right intersection of the top horizontal line and the far right vertical line. And it just makes for a very pleasing image. He's lined up perfectly there. You can see he was on a boat, but you also have all this beautiful negative space to the left where you can see where he's going, and he's heading towards the beach. I included this example on the left of my good friend Wes, who is taking a photo on a beautiful morning near Penns Creek in Pennsylvania. And I wanted to include this because it just shows that the same rule can apply for vertical oriented photos and video. So you can see here, Wes himself is lined up with the left vertical line. His camera is kind of perfectly centered in that left column. And then opposite that, even the telephone pole is kind of centered in the right column. And then even the mountains are touching that top horizontal line. So again, this isn't, a rule that you have to use, and like your subjects don't have to always end up at a perfect intersection or on a line, but it's just a good rule of thumb to start with. And the final example I included was this photo I took in Yosemite of the Three Brothers Peaks. And it's just an example of me using the grid to help make sure my photo is perfectly symmetrical. I wanted the peaks in the middle because it had this cool reflection off the Merced River. And having the grid is just even helpful when you're taking symmetrical images, because obviously you can see there, the peaks are perfectly in line with that middle column there. So another, I guess, idea I wanted to briefly mention with composition that you've probably heard of is the fact that I always like to add what's called depth of field to my images when I can. And really that just simply means including subjects and objects at different distances from the camera. So you pretty much, the depth of field is the distance between the nearest and the furthest objects in an image. So if you can add something in the foreground, like the leaves here in this Annapolis image, it can transform an otherwise pretty average shot. And you can just see here, even some of the leaves are at different distances. You have the ones real close to the camera, then the ones up top are a little bit further. And it just adds a deeper layer to the image. It adds more context, and it makes it just more interesting to look at. So I also wanted to mention this idea as well before we move on from composition, and that's to keep positive and negative space in mind with your video frames and your still images. And by that, I really just mean to make sure that your image is not too overcrowded. Jamming too much into one image may be the most common beginner's mistake with composition. So remember, less is more in most cases. And I think this photo here is a prime example. It's one of my favorites. It's one my brother took of me after I was sitting on top of Half Dome. And obviously you can see there is tons of negative space in this photo, but I think it looks awesome. So it's really just the subject is centered. The horizon is lined up with that bottom horizontal grid, and then the rest of the image is left just completely blank. So I'd also like to cover some shot types, because this is an important part of, especially of planning and making sure you cover your bases at a shoot or just a day of taking photos and video. So for both photo and video, there are endless shot types that you can capture. We're going to talk about the three most simple types with an extra fourth there, that'll help guide you and make sure, like I said, make sure that you cover your bases at a shoot. So to start up, we've got a close-up, which you can see in the top left here. That is our friend Jonathan again, holding up the fly he was using close to the camera. And close-ups are just shots taken at a really close range that display the greater detail to the viewer. And these shots should be used for an emphasis on the subject. And if it's a close-up of a person, a lot of times they can have more of an emotional reaction. But really just, this is your chance to tell the story of those minute details that you really couldn't tell with any other shot. Next up, we have a medium shot, which you can see the example right below, which is my brother and I sitting on the beach. And this can be described as more of a classical conversational shot where you'll be able to recognize your subject's details without getting too close. And this is just, you really should get a ton of medium shots because they do a good job of showing your subject and telling the story at a length, again, like I said, where you can see the detail, but you're also not far enough away that you're getting the entire environment. So next up, we got wide shots. And the best example of the wide is the top right, which is the shot you just saw earlier of Jonathan getting off the boat. Wide shots are helpful for the viewer to observe all of the scene information in a single shot. And I personally love to use wide and extreme wide shots in both photo and video to establish the location and give a sense of what the landscape and environment looks like that the shoot is happening in. So again, like looking at the wide shot, it just gives more context. You can see Jonathan was on a boat and he has a fly rod and he's getting off the boat and he's heading towards the beach. It just adds so much more context to the story. And then the extreme wide here, which in this case is a drone shot, just shows the landscape. And it helps to set the stage of where we are, what this place looks like. But like I said, there are endless shots and possibilities to include in your video or photo shoot. But if you at least stick to these 3, and 4 if you can, your shoot or work from a particular day or location should be pretty well-rounded. And including all 4 should help you to tell more of a full story. Because you can see they each just individually, even though these were all shot probably within 2 hours, they each individually tell their own story. But when you see them together, they help each other to tell the collective of the entire experience and the entire story. So let's switch over to some outdoor specific tips. Oops. So between basic phone settings, an understanding of solid composition, and a list of shot types to capture, you should be ready to get out there and start practicing. So I wanted to talk about just a couple tips and tricks that I picked up over the years that are good to know when capturing content in the great outdoors. So the first is to prioritize morning and evening light. Because not only is this the best time for photo and video because of the softer golden light, you'll hear a lot of people talking about golden hour. It's the best time to shoot photos and film. But from a wildlife perspective, many animals and wildlife are far more active at dusk and dawn. Number 2 is to always prepare for the weather. Bring some sort of rain gear for both you and your camera equipment, because you never know when an unexpected storm will roll through. And that can be as simple as bringing an extra rain jacket so you can throw it on top of your camera, or even a trash bag. You just, from personal experience, you just don't want to be caught out there with 0 options, or in a lot of cases, sacrificing your rain jacket for your camera gear, which is what I tend to do more often than I should. And my last one I have here is to take calculated risks. And this applies more to those of you who have invested in some equipment. But this is something that I would tell my younger self if I could go back in time. You invested in your gear to create amazing content. So don't be paralyzed by fear and leave it at home when going on outdoor adventures. So it's important to take good care of your stuff, but it's also important to take some risks if you want to push the boundaries of your work. And that being said, don't be too stupid about it, which I probably was here in this photo example. You can see me swimming through the Shenandoah River last summer with my $6,000 cinema camera hovering above the water. And luckily, nothing bad happened there, but it's just an example of what you got to do sometimes to get the shot. So I also wanted to highlight some pre-production and planning a little bit, because I do think it's very important. And as you can imagine, it would not be a good idea to show up at a video shoot with no idea what to make a film of. And still photography can also greatly benefit from a little study and pre-planning. I think planning for any shoot is really crucial. So I at least wanted to cover this topic briefly. So starting with the end in mind would be one of the first tips I have that helps me a lot. So thinking about what is the call to action with this video or series of photos. So in other words, what action do you want your viewers to take, or what message do you want them to take away? And that can be as simple as a photo that showcases the beauty of a mountain lion to or showcases the beauty of a mountain lion to the viewer, or it can be as complex as a video that encourages donations to a cause. But it's just really helpful to have that end goal in mind before you start planning. So once you understand the goal, it becomes easier to plan for the type of content you want to capture. Another helpful tip is to look up photographers or videographers that create similar work and take inspiration from their website or social media. There's a quote I really love, and that's, if you steal from one author, it's plagiarism, but if you steal from many, it's research. And I think the same applies for visual content as well. Get out there, explore, find some artists you love, and take inspiration from their work. And the last thing here, something that I've really learned over the years, and that's to show up with intention and show up with some planning and pre-production done, like we just talked about, but to be flexible and adapt as needed, because honestly, nothing will go the way you planned it 100%. So have a plan, have a general idea of what you want to do, but be ready to pivot and try to tell the story authentically the way it unfolds, because that's the way it should be done anyway. I also just wanted to at least mention that we don't have the time to dive into post-production for photo or video, which can be a separate skill set in and of themselves. But I have included some resources at the end of that description list that'll be on the YouTube video as well. So stories appeal to our senses and our emotions. And in my mind, this makes storytelling the most powerful way to deliver any message. On top of that, visual content is arguably the most powerful way to engage a viewer and an audience on a deeper level. So you can imagine, if you combine the two, you can see why visual storytelling is such a powerful art form. I would argue that my first short film I made, which is on the screen here, shifted my creative mind away from just taking photos and videos at random, more towards taking them with intention and focusing on the stories I was trying to tell with my work. So whether that's building out a more complex documentary or brainstorming what composition and shot type makes the most sense for a photograph of a friend fishing for a striped bass. But capturing photos and videos in nature is so rewarding because it forces you to pay attention on a level that you're not used to. You become much more intimate with the environments you shoot in. And on top of that, it is a blast to share the experiences that you've had with others. So if you are more experienced in photography and videography, I hope you at least got some value from today's presentation. And if you are a true beginner, I hope you feel inspired to use the basics that you've learned today about phone settings, composition, and shot types to get outside and start creating. But thank you so much for your time and listening. And I believe now we're going to hop into more of a question-oriented part of the presentation.
Yeah, that's right, Eric. We do have a question that came in through Facebook during the presentation, and I know that you answered some of your questions, some of the registration questions during your presentation, but I've got a couple of those that I'll throw your way as well. So from Facebook, we have, if you do have to shoot in midday light, is there a quick and easy way to mitigate the harsh bright from a sunny day?
That's a really good question. The answer is yes. and unfortunately it involves purchasing something, and that's you can get something called a polarizer, which is what I use for my cameras. And essentially you just and polarizer and a UV filter, and essentially you can put it on the lens of your camera. I'm sure they make them for the iPhone as well, but the iPhone does a surprisingly good job of adapting midday. But you can put that on your camera lens if you're shooting midday and it's really just too bright. Of course, I would play with your settings first. For those of you that understand ISO or even aperture, I would for starters, I would bump your ISO down as far as possible, and I would crank your aperture up as high as you possibly can and start there. But if you don't want to like manipulate your settings like crazy, I would invest in one of those polarizers.
Yeah, and like being in the shade doesn't always help you out because the the wind is blowing the leaves around and you end up with this like crazy hot spot that's dancing around all over the place. So yeah.
Yeah, and then when you're in the shade, you have such a stark contrast between the darkness of the shade and the super bright in the back, and then it's even harder to either blow out the bright background or the darks will be way too dark in the shade. So yeah, I would definitely look into possibly getting a polarizer.
Awesome. So let's talk a little bit about photo organization. So do you have any tips to make your photo library a little bit more searchable or easy to navigate?
That's a great question too, and that's something that we are constantly trying to get better at the Alliance. Um, I personally kind of think it's about picking a system and sticking to it. I think there's a lot of great options out there. Um, I think Google Drive is probably what I have the most experience in over the years. Um, what I will say about that is that involves a lot of upfront work from you and a lot of work to make sure you keep it organized because you're the one creating the folders and the names of the folders. Um, and there is a way to search through Google Drive as well. That can be pretty helpful. But something we've been using a lot at the Alliance, which I'll kind of plug here too, is a service called Flickr. And that has been pretty great because it has amazing keyword search. Because when you upload the photos on Flickr, it's FLICKR. Um, you have to put in keywords and associate it with a certain album. So pretty much from the second you put it into Flickr, you will be able to search for those photos on a search bar with keywords, which is super helpful when you're in an organization and you have people who need access to those photos who might, had no part in taking them, so might need an easy way to find them.
Okay, so from Zoom, we have what suggestions do you have for a forest landowner who wants to tell the story of their own land?
Ooh, wow.
Yeah, not a technical question.
No,
Great
I love it.
storytelling question.
Yeah, I love it. And that question could be answered many, many different ways. Um, at the Alliance, I mean, a lot of the projects we do, we are constantly thinking about that. What's the most efficient way to tell the story of project X or Y? Um, Forest landowners, story of their own land. It all depends on what the unique story is. I think I would maybe start there. Think about what your unique story is and what medium you want to use to tell it, whether that's a photo series would be really cool. Maybe you could include 5 to 10 photos of your land, or if you have old photos of what your land looked like years ago, you can show the comparison. And maybe even a lot of times what we do is we write something called a photo blog where there's 5 to 10 photos that kind of tell a story. That'll a lot of times be different shot types, and we will accompany a blog with it that tells the story of what happened. And that way, you have this cool physical representation of your about your own story, your own land. But if you wanted to take the video route as well, I think that's always a way to do it. Maybe have yourself talking on camera, or any other stakeholders or people that are involved with your land or any projects that have happened on it. Um, and get some videos of the land showcasing the beauty of it. And always, it's always a good tip to try to show wildlife when you can, to showcase the biodiversity. I know that was just kind of a bunch of random answers, but I hope that was at least somewhat helpful.
Yeah, that's great, Eric. I mean, you hit all the parts of it, just thinking outside the box from a medium standpoint, thinking about what is truly unique about your own story. I think that's it. So that's good stuff. So for your equipment, you are using a DSLR camera question mark. So your polarizer would attach to your camera lens. Is that right?
Yep, that's right. I guess the cameras I use now are technically not DSLRs, they're mirrorless cameras, but I mean, pretty much the same thing. But yes, correct. The filter, you need to make sure it's the right size that lines up with whatever lens you want to use it with. And I will put a link to some of the filters I use in the resource description in YouTube as well. If you were to type variable ND filter on Amazon, there's a host of different options. But like I said, you definitely want to make sure the size of the thread matches up with the particular lens that you're using.
Great. All right, let's do two more questions. So this question comes from Facebook. Reduced background noise can really help differentiate a poor video from a decent video. Any relatively inexpensive equipment for iPhone or non-professional people? Audio equipment, I'm guessing they're asking there.
Yeah. I was just messaging Jenna from the Alliance a couple days ago about this, and there are some what's called lapel mics, which are the small skinny microphones that you can clip on a shirt with a wire. There are some, I think about $20 lapel mics on YouTube that I mean, not YouTube, on Amazon, sorry, that you can use with your phone. So that would be a really great option if you just wanted to purchase a little microphone. But if you just want to, I guess, not even buy anything and hopefully make it a little bit better, I always say move the phone closer to your mouth and make sure that you could, like, you're in an area that doesn't have a ton of background noises. But yeah, if you're looking to purchase something, honestly, I would just get one of those $15-20 lapel mics off Amazon, and you can just plug it right into your iPhone and you should be good to go.
All right. So we did have a question come in while you're answering that one. A request if you could list your equipment in the YouTube description, Eric. So we've got to can probably take care of that,
Yeah,
at least some
absolutely.
of it.
Yeah, I'll make sure that description is well organized, and you'll be able to see both the resources and the equipment links as well.
All right. So for the last question, I've got a two-parter. So do you try to keep your camera settings like ISO, aperture, white balance consistent while shooting? And then I'll tag on to that. If you were going to shoot in low light, what might you do to some of those settings to kind of adapt if you're coming from a lot of light?
Yeah. So the short answer is no, I do not keep my settings consistent. And that's because if you're shooting in manual mode, you have to be adjusting, because even turning your camera 40 degrees to the right, you can completely alter the lighting and you need to readjust. That's why I definitely recommend shooting in auto. There's no harm shooting in auto, especially when you're starting out, because what that means is your camera is automatically changing those levels based off of the input and the light. Um, and to go off of that, or to talk about the low light situation, of course, if you have a professional camera, you have the luxury of being able to bump up your ISO or bump down your aperture as far as you can to try to let as much light in that camera as possible. Um, in with an iPhone, to be honest, they're starting to do a pretty good job of capturing decently low light as well. Um, Again, I would use a flash if you're restricted to an iPhone, especially if you're taking images or pictures of objects up close in the dark. Um, but yeah, as far as if you do have a camera, I would get familiar with the settings. Even if you just shoot an auto, you might want to switch to manual if you're in low light, just to make sure that you can try to let as much light into the camera as possible.
Well, everybody's sticking with us here. We've got a bunch of participants still joined, so we might as well ask the last question that we have up until this point. Actually, you know what? One came in through Zoom while you're talking. Let's do that one too. What iPhone are you using?
That's a great question. I feel like I am clueless to the generations of iPhones after like 4 years ago, but I believe it's a iPhone 11. Last time I checked, it's just this guy here. It's got these two cameras in the back, with a little flash. So it's not even close to being the newest iPhone. But I do know some of the newer ones that are coming out are pretty spectacular. The images that are coming out of them, and a little scary for people like me who have put thousands and thousands of dollars into other cameras.
They keep coming, so we'll keep answering them. Saltwater, how do you
Oof.
combat it?
Yeah, I luckily don't find myself shooting in pure saltwater a lot, but it's a very good note to have. It can be pretty bad if, let's say, you're on a boat and your camera is misted by water and you just don't clean it off. um all I'll do is when I get home, I'll take a slightly damp paper towel and just wipe down my camera, because obviously you don't want to get it too wet afterwards either. But that is a good point. You want to be careful about the amount of salt water you're getting on your gear.
Yeah, I think just like don't panic and take the lens off or do anything if it's wet, you know. It's like keep it intact, you know, because it's just going to get into everything.
Yeah, that's
Uh,
that's a good note.
do you, so let's talk about storytelling. Do you have a general approach to building a story when you film?
Hmm. I would say yes, and I would say it's different for different forms of visual art. So if I know I'm going into a shoot for just photography, it's different than if I'm just, if I know I'm telling a story through video. But kind of back to what I talked about a little bit in the presentation, I would say I always start with the end in mind. I always think about what's the goal of this? What message do we want people to take from this? And then I will start in a document 9 times out of 10, and even just writing something as simple as beginning, middle, end. And you can start right at the end and say, we want people to think mountain lions are beautiful and worth protecting. And then you can work backwards from there to make sure your story has somewhat of like a classical arc to it, like introduction, middle with content, and an ending that is clearly sharing something, making a statement, telling a message. Um, so I think that's my generic answer to that question.
All right. Well, I think we are a little over on time, and I really appreciate everybody's engagement and thoughtful questions that you all have been asking. We are going to follow up after this presentation with an email, and that email will include a uploaded version of this presentation that you can reference. And if you have any additional questions that you think of after the presentation, feel free to use that email And all of our information, contact information as employees is on our website. You can go there and grab it and reach out to us. And we certainly hope that you do so. So thanks again, everybody, for your time today and for joining us for Ask the Alliance. If you enjoyed this presentation, I hope that you visit the Ask the Alliance event page on our website and consider registering for some of the other upcoming topics.